So I thought I'd make a video. My hair's grown. Probably need a haircut soon. Um, so I wanted to talk about some things that were really important. Um, this is regarding my deceased sister. Um, I'm just gonna talk a little bit about this new story of her and experiencing with my mother. And I was just sort of just thinking, and I remember being at the grocery store at Albertsons, and my mother was at Albertsons, and I would be with her, and this happened a few times when I was with her. We went to the grocery store at Albertsons, where I saw President Barack Obama, and he threatened me there. And this is the same place where I saw my biological father, Hector, and Michaela's mother. This is the same place where I saw my father who took care of me, Raymond Palomo, his biological identical twin, who he never got to reunite with. That's where I met him. That's where I saw him. For some reason, at that Albertsons, that's where all that happened. Well, there's a story of me going to Albertsons with my mother, and I remember seeing this little girl who, I didn't attend her funeral. Let's just say that she did have a funeral, and for whatever reason, none of us went there. My mother never addressed to me or any of my brothers acknowledging, especially knowing that I was the same father as her, that she died. But there was no proper burial. There's no flowers. There was nothing. But it's not to say that there was some sort of ceremony. It's just no one showed up. I don't see how my mother could have shown up, and the neighbors, Ivan's, I don't know if Ivan showed up. I don't know if the woman that was always hitting that little girl in front of my mother when she died, if that woman, that transgender, showed up to the funeral. Do you have any understand how disrespectful that could have been? The woman is hitting that little girl in front of you're hitting your daughter in front of you, and then she dies. Do you think she's probably going to be at the funeral? If there was, I just wasn't allowed, or I just wasn't invited. I don't know. But I just know this. Frankie, Julian, and me, and we know there was no funeral. Okay, so for us to attend, my sister, our sister that passed away, Michaela's sister. So, anyway, the story that I wanted to say is we were at Albertsons, and I remember walking with my mother, and I think I was by myself, at least in one of these occasions. You got to understand, when I was a kid, Albertsons was the go-to store. We went even before Walmart ever became Super Walmart. Walmart, when I was about 9 to 10 years old, was very, very different. In fact, Walmart didn't even have groceries. Walmart had like clothing, and it was kind of like an outlet store. What do they call it? Outlet store? It was like a discount clothing store. Everything there was cheap. It was like a dollar store almost, kind of. But they didn't even have grocery stores there. I mean, they didn't have groceries. You couldn't buy food there. It was just like clothing and a few other things like, pancake makers, something like that. And the clothes there that were usually very, very cheap. Something you would find like garage sales and shit. But it was built very different. It wasn't all nice and fancy as it is now. Well, back in those days, Albertsons was the grocery store most of my life that I went to. That Albertsons on Josie Lane, where I met at Josie Lane and Old Denton. That street is the same address where that Albertsons is where I went my whole life as a kid, growing up through my entire teenage life with my dad, with my mom. We went to that Albertsons. Well, that's the Albertsons where I saw. So it was very likely that throughout our lifetime we were more likely to meet when we were randomly going grocery shopping, whether it was mom after work or after school, or just randomly going after an errand, or just heading over there. Sometimes we would see Ivan, or we would see my sister, who had Down syndrome with this transgender, because this transgender who was hitting this little girl in front of my mother was taking her with her. And I remember seeing her in the, like, you know how you put the little kids in the shopping grocery cart. Well, that's what I saw this little girl was in. And I remember being there and literally, like, I don't know, we turned an aisle and we walked down and she happened to be walking past. Like, we turned in on an aisle or whatever it was, and we saw right past each other. My mother never once touched her, made eye contact, show any type of empathy or connection toward this child. It was not of hatred or despise. This is the way that my mother would do. She would walk by and she'd go, oh, hi, oh, hi. You're taking care of the child. Like, I can't help but to be giving birth. And I remember the way that lady would look at my mother like, yeah, I'm taking care of your kid. But like I said, this little girl was being abused. Now, I don't know, you even know her name, Miranda or Marissa. I think it's Miranda, but I don't know, it's either one of the two. But I thought that in her dear life that was very precious to add some credibility to this little girl that used to wear a princess outfit in front of my house. And I've always, the way that the experience entirely felt in our house was she was just throwing away, like in a trash can. Just grab the trash and throw it away. That's the way that the experience was. There was no remorse, let's say remorse, there was no empathy of anything, what do you call, when somebody passes away, there was no chance to mourn correctly with a family over her death. There was no mourning. And, there was no flowers, there was no prayer. I've talked about this so many times already. Now, to my understanding, the reason I'm still bothered by it sometimes is because my mother's identical twin will bring it up. And so whoever's watching these videos counteracts against me and tells my mother's twin to then start telling me these things. So she'll look at me and my mother will be eating and she'll have these VR classes and they'll start telling her what to do and what to say. And she gets trained to do this. And when I'm talking to her, she'll be like, oh yeah, he goes, yeah, I'm just going to go and throw the trash away. And so she says this because she's talking about throwing my dead sister in the trash away. I know it sounds really bad, but that's what happened. It was, for a little girl to be abused like that, what I saw and what went on in our home, there was just no proper burial at all. There was no ceremony in our home. There was no discussion. It was just, okay, goodbye. It wasn't even a goodbye. It was just like, okay, bye. That was your life. So when I saw her, my mother, she wanted to connect, but there was no one to allow it to happen. Because when she had the little girl and we were at Albertsons and she was, she just looked at my mother and I could tell, I didn't know this was my sister. And you got to understand, my mother does not tell me when I'm walking past her, that's your sister, Hector. She doesn't tell me that. We're literally walking past by her. She's in a shopping cart. I'm walking, and she's with this lady, and I'm with my mother, and we're slowly just walking, look at the foods to see what we need and what we're going to get, taking our time. And my mother just looks at her and goes, oh, hi, oh, hi. Sí, yo me estoy mirando la grocería. But you got to understand, by this time, this girl's already been hit a couple of times. And she's treating my mother like shit. So every time that I've ever said that my mother's disowning this child, she's not disowning it because she wants to. No, she has to throw it away because she has to. And if you don't do what I tell you to do, no one is going to come and save you. And then I'm going to hit the child again. And then I'm going to punk you out whenever I charge at you. And then no one's going to find that out because there's no cameras. Yet I was the entire person that saw this shit the entire time. So I say this, And whoever it is with the psychologist, whatever it is, understand that, I don't think this has anything to do with the psychologist either. It's just a memory. You're going to have to talk to Julian and you're going to have to talk to Frankie. Those two people are going to be able to tell you 100% other stories that when we went to Albertsons, they saw Ivan's sister. I mean, they saw my sister, their sister as well, who was mentally challenged and had severe brain damage. I don't know what the circumstances was to this. I understand that she died, a long time ago. But I needed to say this because it is important to me. I like to have faith that, this little girl had a soul and she had a purpose that was greater than the abuse and spitting in her face and kicking her around and slapping her, even long after she's been dead, was meant for. Obviously, she's my direct biological sister. She is the sister of Michaela, and she's also the biological daughter of Hector, which is my biological father. And Jillian and Frankie, me grew up in that house with her being the neighbor, me being the sole representative of that and most of that experience, because I was around Ivan a lot and I saw the abuse and I saw the shit, and I was hanging around riding bikes with Ivan all the time. We were buying stuff at 7-Eleven all the time. So I think it's important for me to talk about, because when we were at Albertsons, my mother, she didn't engage in the child, and it wasn't like a desperation like she wanted to either. It was just like, I just gave birth to a kid, it's just, that's how it happened. And so but you got to understand, I don't know what other threatening behavior was constantly happening between me and my mother and that neighbor. I don't know what that connection was, because I guarantee you this, that lady, she saw me when I was looking out the window a lot of the times. She knew that I was at times, because you could see somebody looking out the window. So imagine what I didn't see when I wasn't there. And this activity's happening all the time. How many times that she could have threatened or been even more aggressive toward my mother. So I think it's important for me to talk about this little girl that I saw at Albertsons, because when I saw her there, I remember she was always used as a weapon in front of me, and you could tell that whenever she was around this little girl, she was like, "Oh, you don't know what I'm going to do to this little girl if you don't straighten up. I get to be your boss." That was the behavior the entire time. That was the energy, that was the expression, because the way that she looked and then looked at the child was like, "Yeah, I'm going to go." And she was like, "Oh, And you got to understand, my mother, I remember my mother like pushing the cart, and she immediately she loses expression in her face, and she goes like this, and she goes, like, kind of numbs her face, like, numbs, and just kind of looking straight ahead, like, this is my child, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing you can do. For anybody that's listening, there's nothing that you can do. This is before, like, a lot of times cell phones. This is, for the most part, cell phones didn't even come out until I was like 8 or 9 years old, and you had to have a lot of money to have one. You had to have a lot of money to have when I was like 8 or 9 years old. But I think it's important for me to talk about, because the idea of it is, I wanted to share, is that we're going to Albertsons, and this happened more than once, where we saw this child, and my mother never touched or engaged in the child. Not even to say, "Oh, that was my daughter," because I remember, like, even waiting in line for buying groceries, and they were in front of us, and my mother is just looking at how she's putting all the groceries and all the food and scanning the food, because remember, you're just scanning how much you're going to get out of that little girl. So I don't understand, like I said, at this point, because I'm very young, but I think I just wanted to share that story that, my mother didn't have interact have interactions with that girl. So it comes for me to even believe even more. My mother never tells me that this is my sister. Not one time. And Frankie was very suspicious. I want to believe that, I think one time, like when Frankie and me were at the grocery store, I think with my mother, Frankie might be able to verify this better than I can. We were at the grocery store and we saw her, and I want to say, I don't know if Frankie told me, but he looked at me and he goes, yeah, you know, that's mom's kid, right? And he says it just like that, like a comedy, like a joke, like a comic kind of way. And I was, what are you talking about? He goes, yeah, I don't. And he keeps looking ahead as we're walking down the hall. I mean, as we can see this little girl. And he goes, yeah, I don't know. Because he was still speculating it, I think, because he wasn't getting a full understanding of what the hell was going on. Because you got to understand, if my father doesn't know, how did Frankie find out? Only through Ivan. And Frankie would have never known, like, how does this little girl, because you got to keep in mind, when Frankie was on the front porch and we were just kids, I remember Frankie kind of made, he made fun of her just joking around. And he goes, and Ivan got really upset and told Frankie, it said, fuck you. I swear to God this happened. And Frankie was like this, and Frankie goes, yeah, she's like a Mongoloid, like, yeah. You know, but Frankie sometimes try to have a comic character to him, but he seemed not to be able to kind of make that character, and I think it could have been because of so much of the sexual abuse and things that were going on, him being confined in a room all the time. But I just know that I remember Ivan saying that to him. And I remember just thinking, because I felt really bad. I remember feeling, nobody is ever going to believe me about this, but this is the truth is. And I remember feeling really bad about this little girl. And I was like, damn, Frankie, you should know better than be doing that. But guess what? Who's getting raped all the time? And I remember many years ago, I remember this when this happened. You know, we saw this little girl, and Frankie had no idea for several years that if that was our sister. So imagine someone living next door to you for several years never knowing that she was your sister. How much information and things have to be going on for Frankie not to even know that? And guess what? A lot of those years when that little girl lived there, most of those years when that little girl lived there, Frankie was getting raped. This is when this situation is happening. So, I thought I'd make a video in support of this little girl and my mother, biological mother. Obviously, you're going to have to talk to Frankie and Julian about any other stories they remember, if any. But as far as that goes, I thought I'd share that, you know, that my mother didn't want to engage or wasn't allowed to. So I thought I would talk about that. I remember that, you know, so wow. I remember her being at the register, and as they were scanning groceries. And you know, it's so fucked up because this is the time when I used to go to church all the time. And I remember thinking to myself about life. And I remember thinking to myself, how do you compare the prices of life? And that's kind of what I remember thinking. How we purchase these food and the price of life right there. But you got to understand that this transgender, she always behaved toward my mother like she was a nuisance and she was like a dumb little girl who didn't know any better. She always behaved that way toward my mother. She was never like, it was always about dominance and control, and you don't know what you're doing. You're just giving birth to kids left and right. That's all your pussy's worth. Because this transgender's pissed off because they were born with dicks and balls and they wanted a vagina and they didn't get it, and they call themselves girls and they want to say that they're girls and they're bitter about that, so then they go after someone that really was born a female, not knowing how much suffering that really is on their part. So I thought I'd make a video on that. I remember very distinctively being at Albertsons and my mother and this little girl, and you know what, and I remember being there, and I remember thinking, God, that must be so hard. I remember thinking, thank God, that must be so hard because she's in diapers and she could mess herself, and you're at a grocery store. People are grocery shopping, people are buying food, and you have this little girl that's throwing up, and God knows she could tell you she threw up all over the floor at Albertsons. I didn't never see that, but I wouldn't doubt it if something like that's happened because she took her to the grocery store maybe a few times. But she stopped taking her there probably because of that very problem. But I do remember her being taken and put on the cart, and my mother just kind of doing this, like, oh, hi, and just like, oh, hi, little girl, like stranger, doing that. And so it's a way of survival, but you're gonna have to talk to Frankie and Jillian. They can tell you the story about that. And just to talk about her life a little bit. I hope that this story kind of resonates a little bit and helps Frankie and Jillian. They got, I'm sure, plenty of stories to tell you as well.